Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, very familiar to us. Paul says, I beseech you therefore by the mercies of God that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you may prove that which is good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. We're familiar with the apostles' exhortation to a renewed mind. Those two verses have been the subject of countless apologetics talks and lectures and many sermons. You'd think when Paul expresses the need for a renewed mind, he would proceed to explain how we can apply that renewed mind. What does this method, what does it look like when it's worked out? We would expect him to say something about convincing unbelievers or something like that. But instead, we get the next verse. One of the more overlooked passages, one of the most overlooked verses in Scripture, Romans 12:3. For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one the measure of faith. Instead, Paul applies a renewed mind by saying, through God's grace, you should not think of yourself more highly than you should. Now, why would he waste such a wonderful opportunity to talk about high things by talking about being sober and not thinking of yourself with pride? Well, because that's what a renewed mind looks like. It looks like humility, according to the apostles. And then he goes on to say, after he says to think with humility, he says that we should we should appreciate the spiritual gifts of others. Sometimes for us, a renewed mind equals something like powerful arguments, or charismatic leadership, or getting people to think the way that I think, which is God's way. But that's not a renewed mind. A renewed mind for Paul is when we look at people and we appreciate what God is doing in them, even when it's not what God is doing in me. He made a very wide and diverse world. I'm not saying we are called to be okay with sin. No, we should not be okay with sin. But just because someone else's walk is not the same as mine, that's not a bug. That's a feature. That's one of the gifts that He gives us. The most powerful apologetic for the Christian life is a humble heart that is grateful for what God is doing, not only in me, but in and through other people. So when others see your renewed mind, when they see that you don't think of yourself more highly than you should, they're more likely to listen when you have something to say. And then you can walk together with renewed minds as we pursue the sanctification which is our privilege as God's children. Now, as we prepare for our time of confession, turn to hymn 80 and let us sing.